It was a quiet afternoon, one that Isla, a young girl with a disability, would never forget. Left to play with her toys, she had no idea that her peaceful world was about to be shattered. What started as a normal day soon took a terrifying turn when Carmen, the local HOA president, decided to intervene in a way that no one could have predicted. Carmen, known for her strict enforcement of community rules, had been watching Isla and her mother, Nina, from her window, ready to stir up trouble. But what Carmen did next wasn't just a petty complaint, it was an attack. Claiming she was simply repairing equipment, Carmen pressed a live electrical device against Isla's body, shocking her mercilessly. Isla, fragile and vulnerable, was left in disbelief, unable to comprehend why anyone would hurt her like this. As the shockwaves of the incident spread, Nina rushed to her daughter's side, heart racing, as she tried to make sense of the cruel actions that had just unfolded before her eyes. Carmen, however, stood there with a calm indifference, offering nothing but an excuse. But this wasn't just an act of malice, it was the beginning of a much bigger conflict. In this story, Nina's fight for justice is only beginning, and Carmen's true nature will soon be revealed. As the truth comes to light, the shocking twist behind Carmen's behavior will force everyone to question the kind of person she truly is. Would you stand by and let this happen? Or would you fight for what's right? It was a typical afternoon in the quiet suburban neighborhood where Isla and Nina lived, a place where everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. The small, tree-lined streets were peaceful, with the hum of life moving slowly and steadily. Isla, a bright and spirited girl with a disability, had spent most of her time indoors. But today, her mother Nina had allowed her to sit by the window and play with her favorite toys. The sun filtered through the blinds, casting a warm glow across the room, as Isla's laughter echoed gently in the house, unaware of the storm brewing outside. In the same neighborhood, Carmen, the HOA president, had been watching. She lived just a few houses down, and it wasn't the first time she'd had her eyes on Nina and Isla. Carmen, a woman known for her rigid enforcement of HOA rules, had built her reputation on control. If you didn't conform to her idea of what was acceptable, she made sure you knew it. From the beginning, Nina had felt the weight of Carmen's judgment. Small things, like the way Isla would sometimes play too close to the sidewalk, or how Nina didn't always keep the garden in perfect order, had been pointed out, critiqued, and sometimes even penalized. Carmen's eyes never missed a detail, and today, she had decided it was time to take action. There was no reason, no real issue between Isla and Carmen, just the relentless need for control that Carmen felt over the people in her neighborhood. Carmen had seen something that day, perhaps it was Isla's laughter that grated on her nerves or the fact that Nina hadn't noticed the proper way to organize her flowers in the front yard. It wasn't clear, but what was clear was that Carmen wasn't going to let it slide. From her window, she had spotted Isla playing alone, and the wheels in her mind began turning. She could already feel the urge to assert her authority. The HOA had rules for a reason, after all, and it was her job to make sure those rules were followed, even if it meant taking matters into her own hands. The tension between the two women had been building for weeks. Nina had tried to avoid confrontation as much as possible, opting to keep her head down and her focus on Isla's well-being. But Carmen wasn't someone who let things go easily. She had made it known, through passive-aggressive comments or veiled threats, that she didn't like how Nina lived. It was as if Nina's life was an inconvenience to Carmen's vision of a perfect community. Today, it seemed, that simmering animosity was finally about to boil over. Carmen had watched from her window for a while, waiting for the moment she would make her move. She was known for her strictness but also for her cold, methodical approach. It wasn't about helping, it was about controlling. And the longer she watched, the more she convinced herself that something had to be done. Isla, blissfully unaware of the looming danger, was simply lost in her play. Her disability meant that she didn't have the same mobility as most kids her age, and that fact alone made her stand out, often in ways that Carmen would not tolerate. Isla's joy, her innocence, and her very existence seemed to rub Carmen the wrong way. Perhaps it was the way Isla was so content in her own world, unaffected by the rules that everyone else seemed to follow so strictly. Isla was different, and that difference bothered Carmen. By the time Nina stepped out of the house to check on Isla, Carmen had already prepared herself for what she was about to do. She had always prided herself on being the fixer in the community, the one who made sure everything was in its place. And in her mind, Isla's carefree afternoon, her very presence in that yard, was an affront to the order she desperately sought to maintain. As Nina walked towards Isla, she didn't see Carmen watching from behind the curtains. She was lost in the joy of seeing her daughter's smile, something that was rare but precious. But Carmen didn't share that view. She was already moving, determined to make her correction. What began as a simple intervention, the idea that she was just repairing equipment, quickly escalated into something far more sinister. The tension between them had always been there, but now it was about to explode. Nina, caught in the crossfire of a battle she never asked for, would soon face a decision that would change everything. It was clear that Carmen was no longer just a neighbor, she was an enemy. And the events that were about to unfold would tear through the community's fragile peace, forcing everyone to pick sides and face the reality of what had truly happened. The question now was, would Nina be able to protect Isla, or would Carmen's oppressive authority crush them both? The storm was coming, and it was about to hit harder than either woman could have imagined. Tension had been building between Carmen and Nina for weeks, but neither of them could have predicted what would unfold next. As Isla sat on the porch, humming softly to herself, lost in the world of her toys, Carmen had already made her move. She had been standing in the shadow of her window, watching every move, calculating her next step. There was no warning, no hesitation, just a swift, chilling decision that would change everything. In one sudden, jerking motion, Carmen emerged from behind her house, her face twisted in cold determination. She wasn't carrying anything overtly threatening, just a small piece of electrical equipment that, to an untrained eye, might have seemed harmless enough. But to Isla, it was anything but. As Carmen approached her with the device in hand, Isla remained oblivious, her back turned as she played with her dolls, humming in her world of innocence. Before Nina could react, Carmen had reached Isla, her movements as quick and decisive as a predator on the hunt. Without a word, Carmen pressed the live electrical device against Isla's delicate skin, sending an electric shock that cut through the quiet afternoon like a knife. The jolt hit Isla's body so hard that it seemed to freeze her in place. Her body trembled violently as the shock coursed through her, the muscles in her limbs seizing, her face contorting in pure, unfiltered pain. Isla's eyes went wide as she gasped for breath, her mouth opening as if to scream, but no sound escaped. The air itself seemed to hang heavy with tension. Nina's heart pounded in her chest as she turned, just in time to see her daughter's body jerk and convulse in shock. The moment was slow, but excruciating. It felt like time had stopped. The smell of burnt plastic filled the air, mingling with the stench of raw fear. Isla! Nina screamed, her voice cracking as she rushed toward her daughter. Her feet barely seemed to touch the ground as she moved. She could feel her breath catch in her throat, panic flooding her system as she reached her daughter, but she was too late. The shock had already taken its toll. Isla crumpled, her fragile body falling limp in her mother's arms. Her skin was pale, her breathing shallow, and her lips trembled as though struggling to find a way to speak. But there was nothing. Just the eerie silence that followed the chaos. Nina held Isla close, her hands shaking as she checked for signs of life. Isla, honey, talk to me. Please, talk to me. Her words were desperate, but her daughter could barely respond. Every second felt like an eternity. Her heart raced, each beat a painful reminder of the horror unfolding before her. She could feel Isla's body quivering, the shock still coursing through her system, but it was like the world had suddenly gone quiet. There was no siren, no warning, just the deep, unsettling sound of Nina's heartbeat pounding in her ears. Carmen, standing nearby, remained disturbingly calm, her expression unreadable. She looked at Isla like she had simply fixed a broken appliance, completely unaware, or perhaps uncaring, of the pain she had caused. "It's just some equipment," Carmen said flatly, as though the shock was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "I was repairing it. That's all." Her voice was matter-of-fact, almost dismissive, as if Isla's suffering had been entirely justified. But Nina could not comprehend Carmen's words. What had just happened? What had she done to her daughter? In that moment, everything about Carmen's calm demeanor felt like a betrayal. The woman who had always pried into their lives with judgment and disdain had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. This was no longer about neighborhood rules, it was about something far darker. "Are you insane?" Nina shouted, her voice rising in fury as she stood protectively over Isla. "You can't just shock my daughter." But Carmen remained unmoved, her stance rigid, eyes cold. The world around them seemed to blur, fading into the background as Nina's entire focus zeroed in on Isla, on her fragile, vulnerable little girl, who had just been harmed in the most unjustifiable way. The pain in Isla's eyes, the helplessness in her body, was enough to drive Nina to the brink of madness. But despite the overwhelming sense of fear and anger, one thing was clear: this wasn't over. This was just the beginning of a battle Nina never expected. And Carmen? She would have to answer for what she had done. The seconds after the shock felt like hours. Nina's heart pounded in her chest, her body frozen in a state of shock as she cradled Isla in her arms. The world around her seemed to blur, her vision narrowing to nothing but Isla's trembling form. Her little girl, once full of life and joy, was now pale and weak, her body shuddering with aftershocks from the electric jolt. Isla's lips quivered, and her wide, unblinking eyes were filled with confusion and fear, as if she couldn't comprehend what had just happened. "Isla, baby, please," Nina whispered, her voice breaking. She pressed her hand to Isla's forehead, feeling the dampness of sweat against her skin. "Talk to me, please, tell me you're okay." But Isla couldn't respond. She was too frightened, too disoriented by the pain that still lingered in her body. Her small hands trembled as they clung to Nina, but her voice, her once joyful, energetic voice, was silent. The silence between them was deafening, filling the air with an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Isla was so young, so vulnerable, and Nina could see that she was trying to process the unimaginable. But how could she? How could anyone? No child should have to endure something like this, let alone at the hands of someone they thought was just another neighbor. Nina's mind raced. Was her daughter seriously injured? Could there be lasting effects? Her thoughts were spiraling, but all she could do was hold Isla tightly, whispering promises she could barely keep, desperate to soothe her. "You're going to be okay. I won't let her hurt you anymore." But even as Nina held her, Carmen stood off to the side, completely detached, as if the moment hadn't affected her in the least. Carmen's eyes were cold, almost indifferent, as she crossed her arms over her chest, watching them with a clinical detachment that sent a chill down Nina's spine. Nina's eyes shot up to Carmen, her voice trembling with rage. "What have you done? What's wrong with you?" she demanded, her fists clenched at her sides. "You shocked my daughter. Why? Why would you do that?" Carmen simply looked at Nina, her expression unchanged, and shrugged nonchalantly. "I was repairing the equipment," she said, her voice flat, as though the words were meant to calm the situation, not escalate it. It was a simple fix, nothing more. Nina's heart sank, the weight of Carmen's words settling on her like a crushing wave. Repairing equipment? She had just electrocuted Isla. There was no justification, no excuse that could ever explain the trauma Isla had just suffered. Carmen's casual dismissal of the situation only deepened the anger and confusion that was boiling within Nina. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. How could someone be so callous, so devoid of empathy? Repairing the equipment? Nina repeated in disbelief. Her voice was shaky, but there was no mistaking the fury that burned in her eyes. "You don't shock people to repair anything, Carmen. You don't do that to anyone, let alone a child." Her breath came in short, ragged bursts as she moved closer, wanting nothing more than to make Carmen understand the magnitude of what had just happened. But Carmen remained unfazed. She didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't even show the slightest hint of remorse. Instead, she crossed her arms even tighter, her gaze cold and unrepentant. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, almost dismissively. "She was in the way, and the equipment needed to be fixed. I wasn't trying to hurt her." The words hit Nina like a slap in the face. Carmen's complete lack of remorse was staggering. There was no shame in her voice, no sign of understanding just how wrong her actions had been. It was as though Isla's pain meant nothing to her, just another inconvenience in her mind that needed to be resolved. Nina couldn't wrap her head around it. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't an accident. Carmen had intentionally hurt Isla, and she was standing there as if it were all perfectly justified. Isla, still trembling in her mother's arms, let out a small whimper, her eyes filling with tears. The sight of Isla's pain shattered Nina's already broken heart. She could see the fear in Isla's eyes, the confusion, the hurt, but also something else, trust. Isla had always trusted the people around her, trusted that the world was a safe place, and now that trust had been shattered in the most cruel and senseless way. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Nina's anger was burning hot, but it was mixed with something far deeper, fear. Fear for her daughter's safety. Fear that Carmen might continue to get away with her actions. Fear that there would be no justice, no accountability. But one thing was certain, Nina wouldn't let this go. She would not stand by while her daughter, her precious Isla, suffered because of Carmen's cruelty. She didn't know what the next steps would be, but she knew she couldn't let Carmen's lack of remorse define this moment. She would fight for Isla. And she would fight until Carmen understood the true weight of what she had done. The days after the shocking incident were a blur of emotions for Nina. Isla had been physically recovering, but the psychological impact was deep. Every time Nina looked at her daughter, she saw the fear in her eyes, a fear that wasn't just of Carmen, but of the world she had once believed to be safe. Isla's laughter, once so pure and innocent, was replaced by silence, and Nina couldn't stand it. Something had to be done. Nina knew she couldn't let Carmen's callousness go unpunished. But she also knew that confronting Carmen head-on might not be enough. Carmen was too powerful in the community. She was the HOA president, a position she'd held for years, and she wielded that power like a sword. Nina needed to dig deeper, to find the truth behind Carmen's actions, and she wouldn't rest until she uncovered it. Nina began her investigation quietly, starting with the people in the neighborhood. She spoke to neighbors, trying to gather information about Carmen's past behavior, hoping to find a pattern. It didn't take long before she discovered something that shocked her to the core. Carmen's reputation was far worse than Nina had initially imagined. Over the years, Carmen had alienated nearly every neighbor with her oppressive demands and arbitrary rules. But it wasn't just about enforcing HOA regulations. Carmen had a personal vendetta against anyone she deemed different or out of line. Nina learned that Carmen had a history of targeting families she considered a nuisance, from issuing unjust fines to outright bullying. There was even a rumor that Carmen had once intentionally cut down a family's fence because it didn't meet her standards. But nothing compared to what she had done to Nina and Isla. As Nina pieced together the puzzle, it became clear that Carmen's actions towards them weren't just about maintaining order, it was about control. Carmen had always been the type to seek dominance, to manipulate others into bending to her will. And Nina, with her strong-willed daughter and refusal to comply with every rule Carmen imposed, had become her latest target. The discovery was a revelation, but it only fueled Nina's resolve. She had to confront Carmen, not only for Isla but for the entire neighborhood, which had been living under Carmen's oppressive thumb. But Nina wasn't going to let this be a quiet confrontation. She needed to make sure that Carmen's cruelty was exposed, and that no one would ever let her get away with this again. The opportunity came one evening when the neighborhood gathered for a mandatory HOA meeting. Carmen, as usual, was standing in front of the group, taking charge of the proceedings. The meeting was filled with the usual complaints and trivial grievances, but Nina knew this was her chance. She wasn't going to let Carmen's facade of control stand any longer. She had gathered enough evidence, and it was time for the truth to come out. As Carmen spoke, Nina stood up, her voice cutting through the room. "Excuse me, Carmen," Nina said, her tone firm but controlled. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to her. "I think it's time we talk about the real issue here. The issue that you've been hiding from everyone." Carmen's face immediately hardened, her eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about, Nina?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "I'm talking about what you did to my daughter," Nina replied, her voice rising with emotion. "You shocked her with electrical equipment, and you did it with no remorse. You thought you could get away with it because you're the HOA president, but I won't let you." She took a deep breath, steadying herself before continuing. "And I've uncovered the truth about you, Carmen. The way you've treated people in this community, how you've used your position to bully and control others, this has to stop." The room was dead silent, and Nina could feel the weight of every gaze upon her. Carmen stood there, her face reddening with anger, but she didn't speak. Nina pressed on. "You may have used fear and intimidation to get what you wanted, but not anymore. I'm here to make sure you face the consequences of what you've done." Carmen finally spoke, her voice a low growl. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she spat. "This isn't how it works here. I'm in charge. I always have been, and I always will be." But Nina wasn't backing down. "Not anymore," she declared, her voice steady. "You've crossed a line, Carmen. And now the whole neighborhood will know what you've done. I'm taking this to the authorities." The finality of Nina's words hung in the air. Carmen's smug expression faltered, and for the first time, Nina saw a crack in her armor. But Carmen quickly recovered, her face twisted in fury. "You think you can just ruin me?" Carmen sneered. "You have no idea who you're messing with." But Nina wasn't intimidated. She had gathered her strength, and the truth was on her side. As the meeting room buzzed with murmurs, Nina turned and left, her head held high. She knew that the battle was far from over, but she had made her stand. The truth was out, and Carmen's reign of terror was coming to an end. As Nina walked out of the room, her heart swelled with a sense of triumph. She had done it, not just for Isla, but for everyone who had suffered in silence under Carmen's oppressive rule. The fight for justice had only just begun, but Nina was ready to see it through to the end. In the weeks following the confrontation, Nina made it her mission to ensure that Carmen faced the consequences of her actions. Nina's fight wasn't just about getting justice for Isla, it was about protecting every vulnerable person in their community from the tyranny Carmen had so easily imposed. Armed with evidence and the support of several neighbors who had been victims of Carmen's cruel behavior, Nina took the matter to the authorities. It didn't take long for the truth to come out. Carmen's actions, including the illegal use of electrical equipment on Isla, were enough to warrant an investigation. Soon, Carmen found herself facing not only legal charges but also the loss of her position as HOA president. The community that once feared her now stood united against her, and the once dominant figure who had wielded control over so many was now nothing more than a person facing the consequences of her cruelty. For Nina, the victory felt sweet, but it was bittersweet. No legal consequence could undo the harm Carmen had caused to Isla, but it was a step toward accountability, and for that, Nina was grateful. As the days passed, Isla slowly began to recover. The trauma didn't vanish overnight, but Nina saw glimpses of the old Isla returning. There was still fear in her daughter's eyes, but there was also a quiet resilience, a spark of hope that wasn't there before. The resolution wasn't perfect. No one could undo the pain, but Nina had learned an invaluable lesson through it all: the fight for justice, no matter how difficult, was always worth it. She had stood up not just for her daughter but for the people who had been silenced, for the ones who had suffered in the shadows of a bully's reign. In that, there was power. For Isla, the lessons were different, yet just as profound. She had learned that no matter how small or vulnerable someone might seem, their voice mattered. She had witnessed firsthand the power of standing up to someone who wronged her and the importance of having a mother who would fight tooth and nail to protect her. As Nina sat by Isla's side one evening, watching the sunset, she whispered, "No one will ever hurt you again, Isla. We've fought for you, and will always protect you." And as Isla smiled, a tear rolling down Nina's cheek, they both knew that the darkness of the past would never fully fade, but they would always find the strength to face whatever came next, together. The community had changed, too. No longer would people remain silent in the face of injustice. The fight for one's voice had become a fight for everyone's. In the end, justice had been served, not in a courtroom alone, but in the hearts of those who dared to stand up. And that, Nina realized, was the greatest victory of all. What would you do if you were in Nina's shoes? Would you stand up for justice, no matter the cost, or would you let fear dictate your actions? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If you found this story powerful and inspiring, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that challenge the status quo. Share this video with your friends and family, and help spread the message that standing up for what's right can make all the difference.